This isn't a story about taming a beast. It's a story about listening to a silence. And what one man heard in that silence would not only save a life, it would uncover a lie that had poisoned an entire town for years. Our story begins in Havenwood, Oregon, a town tucked so deep in the misty forests it felt like the rest of the world had forgotten it existed. And for Caleb Mitchell, that was the whole point. At 28, he moved through life like a ghost, his past a constant invisible weight on his shoulders. He was a former Army canine handler, a job that had given him a purpose, a partner and a bond so deep it felt like it was woven into his soul. But that was before the blast of sand and fire, before the silence that followed, before he came home with an honorable discharge and a hole in his life the exact shape and size of Titan, his bomb-sniffing partner, who had died in his arms. Now every morning his hand still felt the phantom weight of a leash that was no longer there. He worked at a local lumber yard, the roar of the saws, a welcome noise that drowned out the memories. But the quiet hours were the hardest. It was during one of those deafeningly quiet afternoons that he found himself walking toward the one place he had been avoiding, the Havenwood Animal Rescue. It was a low-weathered building at the edge of town, and the air around it hummed with a symphony of desperate hope, the barks, the whines, the lonely cries of the forgotten. The man who ran the place was Elias Vance, a figure as weathered and worn as the building itself. With a face carved from granite and eyes that held a permanent storm cloud of cynicism, he moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had seen too much disappointment. He watched Caleb walk in, his gaze sharp and unwelcoming. "Here to look," Elias grunted, not bothering to look up from a worn ledger. "Or to leave." "Just looking," Caleb said, his voice quiet. He walked down the main kennel aisle, the cacophony of barking a familiar pain. He saw dogs of every shape and size, all vying for a moment of attention, a flicker of hope. But Caleb was drawn to the very last kennel, the only one that was completely silent. Inside, curled on a thin blanket, was a black Labrador. He was large, but his posture was small, folded in on himself as if trying to disappear. His coat, which should have been glossy, was dull and lifeless. He didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge the other dogs or the footsteps. He just stared unblinking at the cinder block wall. A small handwritten card on the kennel door simply said, "Bear, 6 months." Caleb knelt, his heart aching with a painful recognition. This wasn't aggression. This was something far worse. He'd seen it in soldiers who had lost their entire unit, a complete and total shutdown of the spirit. It's a psychological phenomenon some call kennel shock or learned helplessness. It's what happens when a soul, human or animal, decides that hope is too dangerous a thing to feel. The body is still there, but the light inside has gone out. "Don't waste your time with that one." Elias's voice cut through the air, startling him. The old man was standing right behind him. "Been like that since the day he arrived. Won't eat unless you force him. Won't walk. Just stares. He's a lost cause." Caleb stood up, turning to face Elias. He looked from the old man's bitter, resigned face to the dog who had become a statue of grief. Everyone saw a broken animal, but Caleb, in that profound, echoing silence, saw a mirror. He knew that pain doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quietest souls that carry the heaviest burdens. And in that moment, a flicker of something he hadn't felt since Titan's death sparked within him. A purpose. "I'll volunteer," Caleb said, his voice clear and steady for the first time in months. "I'll clean kennels, haul food, whatever you need." Elias squinted, his suspicion a palpable force. "We don't need charity, son." "It's not charity," Caleb replied, his gaze locked on the black Labrador. "It's a job, and I'll start with him." A humorless laugh escaped Elias's lips. It was a dry, rattling sound like stones in a tin can. He shook his head and walked away, muttering just loud enough for Caleb to hear. "Suit yourself, but you can't save something that doesn't want to be saved." But as Caleb pulled up a discarded bucket and sat down outside the silent kennel, he knew Elias was wrong. The question wasn't whether Bear wanted to be saved. The real question was if he, a man still drowning in his own grief, had enough strength left to build a lifeline for them both. As the afternoon sun faded and the shelter's sounds softened to weary whimpers, Caleb began his vigil, not with words or commands, but with the one thing he had to offer his own patient, broken silence. He was about to knock on the door of a soul that had been locked for months, unaware that the key he was searching for would also unlock a secret that would tear Havenwood apart and expose the ghost that had been haunting this town and this dog all along. Healing a broken spirit is not an act of force, it's an act of translation. You have to learn the language of their silence, and for Caleb, his first lesson began the next day and the day after that, and for every day that followed. He kept his promise. He showed up before his shift at the lumber yard and stayed until Elias kicked him out at dusk. He cleaned kennels, hauled 50-pound bags of food, and patched up a leaky roof, earning a grudging respect from the old man. But his real work, his true mission, began and ended at the last kennel on the left. He never once tried to enter Bear's space. Instead, he simply sat outside it, on that same overturned bucket, creating a small island of calm in the shelter's sea of chaos. He brought with him old dog-eared paperbacks from a thrift store, Hemingway Steinbeck, London, and he read aloud. His voice was low and even, the same steady cadence he had used for years to soothe Titan during the long, tense waits before a mission. He wasn't speaking to the dog, but rather speaking for him, filling the oppressive silence with stories of wilderness survival and loyalty. For the first week, there was nothing. Bear remained a statue, a black hole of grief, his gaze fixed on the wall. Elias would walk by, shake his head, and scoff. "Still talking to the wall, Mitchell?" But Caleb didn't waver. He understood a fundamental truth that so many well-meaning people miss when faced with trauma: you can't rush healing. The biggest mistake is to treat a wounded soul like a project to be fixed, smothering them with pity or forced affection. That's about making yourself feel better. True empathy is about giving them the space to choose their own way back and the patience to wait for them to take that first step. The first step came on day 9. It was barely perceptible. As Caleb read a passage about a wolf from The Call of the Wild, one of Bear's ears, the one not facing the wall, twitched. Just once. A tiny flicker of life in the stillness. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, but he didn't react. He just kept reading, his voice never changing. A week later, a second step. Bear shifted his weight, turning his head just enough to watch Caleb with one eye. And a few days after that, a miracle. As Caleb placed his morning bowl of food by the kennel door, Bear slowly, deliberately rose to his feet, walked over, and ate. It was a victory more profound than any medal. The process was painstakingly slow, a dance of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But progress was progress. Just as this fragile trust began to form, the outside world came crashing in. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the shelter one morning, and 2 men in sharp suits stepped out, their polished shoes looking comically out of place in the gravel lot. They were from a development corporation. They unrolled a set of blueprints on the hood of their car, showing Elias images of gleaming luxury condos. The Havenwood Animal Rescue, they informed him with cold corporate politeness, was sitting on prime real estate. They had bought the land. He had 60 days to vacate the premises. 60 days to find homes for over 100 animals before the bulldozers arrived. The news hit the small shelter like a death sentence. The ticking clock was now audible each second, a hammer blow against their dwindling hope. The weight of it all seemed to settle on Elias, aging him a decade overnight. That same afternoon, driven by a new urgency, Caleb felt he had to push. He opened Bear's kennel door for the first time, not to enter, but simply to leave it open as an invitation. He sat on the floor, cross-legged, and waited. After 10 long minutes, the dog took a hesitant step out, then another. He sat near Caleb, but not touching him, a silent partner in their shared uncertainty. It was then, in a gesture of pure instinct, that Caleb reached out to gently groom the dog, his fingers working through the matted fur on Bear's neck. And that's when he felt it. Hidden beneath the thick fur on the inside of Bear's left ear was a small raised scar. It was old, faded, but unmistakable. He gently parted the hair. It wasn't just a scar, it was a tattoo, a crude, hand-poked symbol of a raven holding a broken arrow in its talons. Caleb froze, his blood running cold. He had spent years in the K-9 Corps. He knew every official unit insignia, every standard military marking. This was none of them. This was something else entirely, something specialized, something secret. In an instant, the entire story shifted. This wasn't just a sad, abandoned shelter dog. The silence he had been trying to understand wasn't just born of loss. It was a silence built to keep a secret. Elias had said he'd found the dog tied up outside a year ago, a stray. But this tattoo wasn't the mark of a stray, it was the mark of a soldier. And as Caleb looked into the dog's deep, sorrowful eyes, he realized he wasn't just fighting to save an animal from a bulldozer. He was now fighting to uncover the truth of a past someone had tried very, very hard to bury. The discovery of the tattoo changed everything. It turned Caleb's mission from an act of empathy into a race against time to solve a mystery. With the developer's 60-day deadline looming like a guillotine, every hour mattered. He spent his nights scouring online forums for military insignia, searching for any mention of a raven with a broken arrow. He found nothing. It was as if the unit never existed. Meanwhile, his bond with the dog, whom he now privately thought of as a fellow soldier, deepened. He began giving quiet, single-word commands during their walks in the woods behind the shelter, simple things from his own K-9 training. Sit. Stay. Watch. The dog's response was immediate, his body language shifting from a lost pet to a trained operator. The ghost inside the machine was waking up. The true breakthrough, however, came unexpectedly, born from a moment of sudden violence. One afternoon, a beat-up truck on the highway just beyond the trees backfired the sound, a sharp, explosive crack that ripped through the quiet air. It was a sound horribly similar to gunfire. Caleb flinched, his own combat instincts screaming. But the dog's reaction was staggering. In a flash, the lethargic, withdrawn animal was gone. In his place stood a warrior. The dog ranger, as Caleb now felt compelled to call him, didn't cower or run. He instantly spun around and placed his body directly between Caleb and the source of the sound, his stance low and defensive, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It was a textbook protection maneuver, an act of pure selfless instinct drilled into him through years of training. For the first time, Caleb saw him not as a broken victim, but as the guardian he was born to be. In that moment, he knew without a doubt this dog hadn't just lost a home. He had lost his mission. The confrontation came to a head at the Havenwood Town Hall meeting a week later. The developers, all smiles and sharp suits, presented a glossy presentation of their Havenwood Heights condominium project. They spoke of progress, of property values, of a bright new future, while a slide on the screen behind them showed a picture of the rundown animal shelter with a big red X through it. Their lead representative, a man named Henderson, called the shelter a sad but necessary casualty of progress, and referred to Elias Vance as a well-meaning but ineffective manager of a failing charity. The townspeople murmured, some nodding in agreement, seduced by the promise of new money in their struggling town. Elias sat in the front row, his face like stone, absorbing every insult. Caleb, standing in the back, felt a hot surge of anger. He was about to step forward and speak, to tell them all what he had discovered, but Elias rose to his feet first. The old man walked to the microphone, his movements slow, his silence commanding the room. "You talk about progress." Elias began, his voice raspy but clear, cutting through the sterile corporate presentation. "You talk about the future, but some of us are tasked with remembering the past. This town, this country, it was built by people who did their duty and were then forgotten. This shelter," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "is a place for the forgotten, the old, the scared, the ones nobody wants anymore. Sound familiar?" He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on a few older men wearing veterans' caps. Henderson, the developer, smirked. "That's a very touching sentiment, Mr. Vance, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. The animal is just a dog, and the shelter is just a building." That was the line. Caleb saw something in Elias break. Before he could stop himself, Caleb strode to the front of the room and stood next to the old man. He held up the small notebook where he had sketched the tattoo. "He's not just a dog," Caleb said, his voice ringing with authority. "He's a soldier, and he bears this mark." Elias stared at the drawing of the raven with the broken arrow. The color drained from his face. The stony facade he had maintained for years didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. He stumbled back from the microphone, his hand covering his mouth, a choked sob escaping his lips. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Elias looked up, his eyes filled with a grief so immense it was terrifying to behold. "His name," Elias whispered into the microphone, his voice utterly broken. "His name isn't Bear, it's Ranger." He took a ragged breath, the confession tumbling out of him, a torrent of pain held back for 5 long years. He belonged to my son, Sergeant Ben Vance." The name hung in the air, a name many in the town hadn't heard in years. Ben was killed in a classified operation in the mountains of Afghanistan. The Raven. That was their unit's insignia. They sent Ranger home to me, the only piece of my boy I had left. He looked at the floor, the shame overwhelming him. And I couldn't even look at him. Every time I saw him, I saw my son. I saw what I had lost. So I hid him. I gave him a new name and hid him in plain sight at my own shelter. I was a coward. The truth landed like a bomb, obliterating the petty argument about condos and property values. Elias Vance wasn't a bitter old man who had given up. He was a grieving father who had been trapped in an impossible prison of sorrow. He had pushed Ranger away, and in doing so had poisoned his own soul with grief. The dog's silence wasn't just trauma from a battlefield. It was the profound, soul-crushing sorrow of being abandoned by the last person on earth who was supposed to be his family. The slick developer stood speechless. The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning shame. The entire story had been turned on its head. This was no longer about a forgotten dog. It was about a fallen hero, a father's secret agony, and a town that had nearly allowed its most sacred duty, the duty to remember, to be paved over by a parking lot. The silence that fell over the Havenwood Town Hall was heavier than any stone. It was a silence filled with the weight of a 5-year-old secret of collective shame and of a grief that had finally been given a name. The developer Henderson stood frozen, his corporate smile wiped clean from his face, his glossy blueprints suddenly looking like cheap, meaningless paper. In the face of real human tragedy, his arguments about progress and profit had evaporated into nothing. He had lost, and he knew it. In that moment, the fight was no longer about a building. It was about a reckoning. The story of Sergeant Ben Vance and his loyal canine partner wasn't just Elias's to bear anymore. It belonged to the entire town. He was one of their own, a hero they had allowed to fade into a memory, and Ranger was the living, breathing embodiment of their failure to remember. Later that night, long after the stunned crowd had dispersed, Caleb found Elias sitting alone in the shelter's small office, a single dim lamp illuminating the dust motes in the air. On the desk was a faded framed photograph of a smiling young man in uniform, his arm slung proudly around a sleek black Labrador. It was Ben and Ranger in a time before the silence. The two men didn't speak for a long time. There were no easy words for this kind of pain. Finally, Caleb broke the quiet. "You carried that all by yourself," he said, his voice soft. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. Elias looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Every day," he rasped. "I thought if I didn't say his name maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. I was wrong. It just poisoned everything." He looked at Caleb, a shared understanding passing between them two men who knew the unique shape of the hole a loyal partner leaves behind. "You lost one too, didn't you?" Caleb simply nodded, the memory of Titan a familiar ache in his chest. "You try to honor them by moving on," he said. "But you honored your son by standing still, by guarding his last partner even if you couldn't bring yourself to face him." In that shared moment, the wall between them crumbled. They were no longer a bitter old man and a drifting veteran. They were two guardians of a sacred memory. But the story didn't end in that quiet office. A young journalist from a local paper had been in the audience at that town hall meeting. She saw what everyone else saw. This was more than a local dispute. It was a story about loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet wounds carried by veterans and their families. She wrote an article not for the front page, but for the heart. She didn't title it, "Shelter Faces Foreclosure." She titled it, "Rangers Watch, a Soldier's Dog Still Stands Guard." She published it online. And then something incredible happened. The story was shared, first by a few dozen people in Havenwood, then by a veterans group in Portland, then a Gold Star family in Texas. Within 48 hours, it had gone viral. The raw honesty of a father's grief and his son's loyal partner resonated with millions. Here we see a powerful truth in action. A problem often feels too big to solve, but a personal story gives people a hero to fight for. The cause of saving 100 shelter animals was noble but abstract. The cause of honoring Sergeant Ben Vance and his dog Ranger was personal and undeniable. The trickle of support became a flood. The shelter's ancient phone started ringing off the hook. Small donations came in from across the country, $5 from a student, $20 from a fellow dog lover, $100 from a veteran who simply wrote, "I get it." The people of Havenwood, ignited by this new sense of purpose, took charge. The local VFW post organized a fundraiser. Kids from the high school held a massive car wash with a banner that read, "Honk for Ranger." The online GoFundMe page, titled "Ranger's Legacy," shattered every goal they set. The shame the town had felt was transformed into a powerful, unified force for good. They were no longer just saving a shelter. They were rebuilding a part of their town's soul. Standing in the shelter yard a week later, watching volunteers repaint the faded sign and repair broken fences, Caleb looked over at Ranger. The dog was lying in a patch of sun, no longer staring at a wall, but watching the flurry of activity with calm, intelligent eyes. He was still a guardian. Only now, his watch extended over all of them. The question was no longer if they could save the shelter. The question, now shimmering with unbelievable possibility, was what kind of incredible legacy they could build in a hero's name. The victory, when it came, was not loud or explosive. It was quiet, resolute, and deeply felt. The Rangers' Legacy campaign did more than just meet its goal. It created a tidal wave of support that washed away any chance the developers had. Faced with overwhelming public support and the kind of heartfelt story that no corporation wants to fight, they quietly withdrew their offer. Havenwood had won. But what rose from the ashes of the old struggling shelter was not just a saved building, it was a resurrection. The community didn't just donate money, they donated time, materials, and a renewed sense of pride. The broken fences were replaced with strong new ones. A fresh coat of paint made the old building look bright and hopeful. And over the entrance, a beautifully carved wooden sign was hung bearing a new name that was both a memorial and a promise, the Sergeant Ben Vance K-9 Valor Center. Its mission was clear and powerful: to rehabilitate retired military and working dogs and pair them with veterans suffering from the invisible wounds of service. Elias Vance was a man transformed. The bitter, cynical shell had fallen away, revealing the proud father who had been buried underneath for 5 long years. As the center's director, he moved with a newfound purpose, his grief now channeled into honoring his son's memory by creating a sanctuary for others like him. And Caleb Mitchell, the ghost, who had drifted into Havenwood seeking anonymity, had finally found his home. As the head trainer, he was no longer just tending to dogs, he was mending souls. He had a unique, almost sacred ability to see the soldier still living inside a traumatized animal, and the hero still fighting inside a withdrawn veteran. He knew their silent language because he spoke it himself. The true meaning of their victory was best seen not in the new sign or the fresh paint, but on a crisp autumn afternoon several months later. The center was thriving. Caleb and Elias stood together on a small hill overlooking the training fields, a comfortable silence between them. Below, a young female veteran, her posture rigid with an anxiety that Caleb knew all too well, was being introduced to a gentle-eyed Belgian Malinois, one of their recent graduates. The veteran knelt hesitant, and the dog, instead of jumping, took a soft step forward and rested its head gently on her knee. The woman's shoulders, which had been tense and high, finally relaxed, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was a scene of quiet, profound healing, a perfect echo of Caleb's first fragile connection with Ranger. At Elias's feet, Ranger himself lay peacefully in the grass. His muzzle was now dusted with gray, and his movements were slower, but his eyes were clear and calm. He was no longer a ghost haunting a kennel, but a quiet, revered patriarch finally at ease, his watch complete. Caleb looked at the old, worn leather collar he now kept in his pocket, a relic from Ranger's past life. He thought about the incredible journey from a silent, broken dog in a forgotten shelter to this sprawling field of hope. He realized that true healing wasn't about erasing scars or forgetting the past. It was about giving those scars a purpose. It was about building a future on the foundation of what was lost. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, and the two men stood there watching this new beginning unfold. They hadn't just saved one dog. The legacy of one fallen soldier and his impossibly loyal partner had created a symphony of healing that would now echo through countless other lives, one veteran and one dog at a time. What an incredible journey for Caleb Elias and, of course, the heroic Ranger. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the deepest bonds are forged not in triumph, but in shared silence and shared pain. We have a question for you, our community. Have you ever had an animal in your life who taught you something unforgettable about healing, loyalty, or unconditional love? What did Ranger's story mean to you? Share your stories in the comments below. We truly love reading every single one, and they remind us why we do what we do. If stories like this move you, and if you believe in the profound, life-changing power of the human-animal bond, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Every single click helps these stories of hope reach more people who might need to hear them. We'll be back next week with another unforgettable tale of a connection that defied all odds. Until then, thank you for listening.